First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation for everyone being out today. Um, if you've heard me preach before, this Hebrews 11 is one of my favorite chapters for sure, because of the encouragement it is and things it refutes the world about. And so I think it's worth our while to go through. It's kind of the first part of it kind of gives us a reason, or gives all men a reason that we have faith. And then it deals a lot with examples of faith from the Old Testament, I think completely, at least primarily. So it deals with some things I think we can learn from today. So in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, we notice that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. You kind of have to think about that. Maybe we don't, but the first time you see it, I think you kind of have to think about what that's telling us. So, we hope for, and of course this is talking about with respect to God, we hope for things concerning His will. We have hope and faith that we will inherit those things. And then also it talks about the evidence of things not seen. And then in verse 3, it talks about, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. This one here, I think it's pretty important also. When you think about God making the world, and we hear scientists talk about that, in the billions of years or all those explanations. And you think about the fact that God just spoke these things into existence. When we think about the laws of nature, conservation of mass, the fact that what we have here in this world today is what we've got. You can't get rid of it. You can change it, but you don't get rid of anything, and you don't create anything new. You can, again, change it, but you don't create anything new. But God, at the beginning, created all these things. And to me, as some have said, you kind of have to go with what seems rational to me. That's a lot more rational to me than people thinking that all the mass was in this little ball, or not little ball, but all the mass was together and it exploded. So I just think that from a Christian standpoint especially, that this is a logical thing, that we have faith concerning the way God created the world. In Psalm chapter 33, 33rd Psalm, in the first part of verse 6, it says, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. So again, He just spoke it into existence. Pretty incredible when you think about that. And in verse 9 it says, for He spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. We can see this illustrated in this chapter with some of the examples that it gives here. Or not in this chapter, but in Genesis chapter 1. It talks about, in verse 3, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. So God spoke. We know what He spoke. It happened. And in verse 9 it says, then God said, let the waters under the heaven gather into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. So God said this. And can you imagine the incredible act that this was? When you have the earth here already, but yet He's dividing, it seems, out the land from the seas, and He's pulling it out into something like what we have now. He spoke, and that happened. And then in verse 11 it says, then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in himself on the earth. And it was so. So God spoke this, and it happened. And in verses 14 and 15, it says, Then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. So if you go back and read the record, we know that prior to this, he had already created light. But here he's setting up what seems to be a system of light to better govern days and nights here. But he just spoke, and then that happened. And then in verse 24 it says, Then God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping things, beasts of the earth, each according to its own kind. And it was so. So God spoke, and living things came about. Pretty incredible, but we know that contrary to the way that evolution is talked about, living things coming up out of the water, and things developing over time, that here God just spoke and things actually happened. So, I like to think of it, do you believe in intelligence creating things or chance creating things? And if you believe in intelligence creating things, and you believe this sequence of events, and people that don't like that, they want to come up with some other theory, which is impossible to prove. And in verses 29 and 30 it says, And God said, See, I've given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. So again, God just spoke and these things happened. Before I go to that next point, though, let me just say that there's some other things, some other verses here in Genesis where it talks about God saying certain things and happening. But I use these particular ones because at the end of these verses it said, and it was so. So he spoke it and it happened. Next, we want to notice some of the examples listed here. But we also want to notice that these people weren't perfect, and their walk had challenges to their faithfulness just as we do. So sometimes, in my mind, maybe everybody's mind doesn't work the same way, but we've heard these stories since we were pretty small. We grew up around the church, and we think of these as great people, and they were because they became faithful people of God. But their walk was not always easy. God looked upon them because they were faithful. He brings them out as examples because of their faithfulness. So we want to notice a few of these examples. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 11, it says, By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. We don't have a lot in the Bible concerning actions of Abel, other than just a few things we know about his sacrifice here. But he was killed pretty early on, and this was kind of, he had a brother that had problems as well. But we know that Abel, it says, also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. So Abel was one that he thought of God first. He brought in the firstborn. He brought in the good stuff of the fat, and the Lord respected his offering. But his brother Cain was a man And sometimes you hear things about why Cain's offering was rejected. I'm not sure that some of the conclusions that are formed around that are always correct, but we know that Cain, once he was rejected by God, did have a bad attitude. He had such a bad attitude that he wanted to kill his own brother. Can you imagine? I mean, I had a brother. He and I didn't always get along, but I can imagine wanting to kill him. And I know people at times kill their family members, but you'd have to be pretty angry. And here we're in the cradle of humanity here. Cain and Abel, the children of Adam and Eve, and they are here on the earth, and it's just such a small group, and yet one of them kills another one. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 5, moving on, it says, by faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Not a great deal in the scriptures about Enoch either. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 22 through 24 says, and after he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God. It said that twice. And he was not, for God took him. So Enoch walked with God. But how about his son? How about Methuselah? We know Methuselah as the man that lived longer than anybody in recorded history, 969 years. But what do we know about him besides that? Well, if you add up the numbers, he died like no more than a couple of years before the flood. So what impact did that have on him? And I'm not saying for sure that Methuselah was a bad person, but we know that Enoch walked with God. The point that I'm trying to make about some of these characters is we may think that their support group was great. That's the reason they do so much better, or we think of them so much better, is because they had this support group that helped them. And I'm just saying that may or may not be the case. Certainly God helped them. That was the best support group. And then in verse 7 of chapter 11 of Hebrews, it says, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So Noah was a man that, did some things, did a great thing concerning humanity, and he did something that took him a long time. It says Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. In Genesis 7 and verse 5, it says Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. In 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, it says Noah was a preacher of righteousness, but yet he only saved his family. His immediate family, that is. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, Abraham, of course, is one that we really often, at least I often think of, concerning one of great faith. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as his inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So Abraham, he got these promises. One was an inheritance of the land, and yet he didn't inherit it. It was promised to his people. In Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 19, it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which also received him in a figurative sense. So what would have possessed Abraham to think that God, after commanding him to sacrifice his only son, that he could raise him up? He had, you could kind of see a conflict in his mind between God had told him that, the world's going to be blessed through his son, told him to sacrifice him. How's that going to happen? Most of us probably would be asking God, if we were talking with God, how's this going to happen? This doesn't really make sense. But yet, Abraham moved forward and he was doing what God told him to do. In Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2, we want to notice here that, we talked about the support group. And we think of Abraham as a strong, godly servant. But in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2, it says, and Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. So Abraham's father was an adulterer, it would seem. And maybe he wasn't always an adulterer, but he certainly came from that background where he could have been swayed by something to go the wrong way, but yet Abraham trusted God. In Genesis chapter 20 and verse 2 and then verse 10 and following, it says, now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? And Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. So here, and she became my wife. So here in this reading, we see the point that I'm making by these verses is the fact that Abraham didn't always do right. He had his frailties too. So what made the difference with Abraham? Was it just that God accepted whatever he did? We see that that's not the case. Abraham made mistakes. Actually, he made this particular mistake twice. I think it's chapter 17. He had already made the mistake where he had told someone else that Sarah was his sister. Of course, she was his half-sister, and so he told a half-truth, it would seem. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 11, we want to notice this concerning Sarah herself. It says, by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past age because she judged him faithful who had promised. So Sarah judged him faithful who had promised. Did she have any doubts about that? Well, in Genesis chapter 18, verses 10 through 15, it says, and he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I've grown old, shall I have pleasure, O Lord, being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child, since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I'll return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did lie. So Sarah here had doubt in her mind, of course, at the beginning. But we see here at the top in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, that her ultimate faith fell in God because she judged him faithful with promise. Now, concerning these people in verses 13 and 16 here that we read about, or we studied about here already, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. It talked about Abraham. He hadn't inherited the land. He was a sojourner. Then down in verse 16, it says, but now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 24, it says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction of the people of God than enjoy the passing pleasure of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, where he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn would touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. So Moses had a lot of good characteristics too. But we also know that Moses had issues. But ultimately, it seems, even though he faltered to where he was not able to go into the promised land, concerning his relationship with God, though, it seems that he was right at the end. So Moses was hesitant to take up his role of leader of Israel. When we read about that in Exodus chapter 4, he tried to pass it off, saying, I'm not a good speaker, different things. He wanted somebody else to do it. Moses was discouraged by the fickleness of the Israelites in chapter 14 of Exodus. Moses made mistakes and disobeyed God himself. You remember where he was told to speak to the rock, and he spoke to the people and struck the rock. And so he made mistakes himself. But in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. So even Moses' parents could have feared the king. They could have said, we're not going to go against what the king said here. They could have been putting their lives in danger by doing the things that they did, but they put their trust in God. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30, it says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies of peace. So Rahab was not even an Israelite. In Joshua chapter 2, it tells the story there about her. But we see how that she received the spies and defied the authorities. She was part of the enemy. She was part of that people. But she saw, the power of God. She believed in those things and therefore put her life in jeopardy by helping them. But she recognized the power of God and put herself in alliance with God. We want to notice some things now concerning some additional things that were mentioned here in the reading in verses 32 through 39. It mentions some additional people. It says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sown in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth, and all these have obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise." So the promise that it's talking about that, of course, is the promise of Jesus Christ, him coming in the New Testament. But it does not mean that these men did not do great, or these people did not do great things. You know, it talked about through faith they subdued kingdoms. You know, you could think about Joshua, other men that are mentioned there. They worked righteousness like Samuel. You know, he came in a situation where he was with Eli, the wickedness that Eli's sons were doing. Eli was and his sons were rejected, and yet he did some great things there. They obtained promises. Of course, Joshua and the people obtained the promised land, stopped the mouths of lions. You know, Samson and others dealt with lions and quenched the violence of fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that were mentioned in the classroom period, I believe. Escaped the edge of the sword, David, and fleeing from Saul and others, I'm sure. Out of weakness were made strong. You know, Samson, after his hair was cut, and yet he prayed to God, and he was able to do some things that you wouldn't, that ordinarily he would not have been able to do. Became valiant in battle, David with Goliath and others that he battled with. Then the additional things that we talked about, turning to flight the armies and different things here, which we could have found people for those as well, mocking, scourgings, other things like this. But there's a lot of things that that these people went through, and yet they did not receive the promise. But yet, even though they didn't receive the promise, they benefit by the fulfillment of the promise that happened in the New Testament. In Hebrews 11 and verse 6, it says, this is kind of the crux, I think, of the matter here in this chapter. It says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." In conclusion, we've noticed some things that we've noticed in times past about Romans chapter 15 and how these Old Testament things, you know, even the writer of Hebrews here is referring back to those here, but we've also referred back to some scripture there in the Old Testament and how that can help us with our faith, you know, give us hope, that sort of thing. First, we notice the breadth of God's omnipotence in creating the world by speaking it into existence. So the great power that God had to just speak and things happen. We also notice that these forefathers were not giants before God without any challenges. They were certainly giants in that they were faithful men, but they had their challenges, they had their flaws, and yet what set them apart? The fact that they were found to be faithful. Hopefully we can see that their faith is what carried them through difficult challenges and sometimes great shortcomings. How's the faith of each of us individually toward God today? Certainly, we need to have faith, and certainly we can be discouraged, and certainly we at times do also have problems that we have to work through. But we don't need to become too discouraged. We need to fulfill our obligations toward God. Um, if there's anyone here this morning that needs to render obedience to the gospel, or if you're a Christian, you need to make right some things in your life, we'd like to encourage you to do that at this time as we stand and sing.